Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, February 13th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about a New York special election that was conducted today, in which we have the results this evening. I apologize for the late video, but we have some breaking news out of New York's 3rd District. The Democrats have won here by a very, very large margin in a district that was most recently held by Republican Representative George Santos. Now, this district has been on the radar for national Democrats and Republicans for quite some time now, as it will really be the first true test of the 2024 election season. Democrats were very hopeful that they would have a prime opportunity to win back control of this congressional seat, but did not expect the margin to be nearly as large as it is tonight, and Republicans were hopeful that with a non-scandal-plagued candidate like Mazie Pillop, who is the Republican nominee for this seat, that they would be able to hold on to it when George Santos was taken out of the race. But New York's 3rd District is fundamentally a swing district. Lee Zeldin, the Republican nominee for governor back in 2022, ultimately won this district, as did George Santos, by around 8 points. In the 2020 election, these same congressional district boundaries, it was not the district at the time, but the same boundaries, elected Tom Suozzi by around 10 points and Joe Biden by around 8 points, and so you see that this is a district that has certainly swung back and forth. But Tom Suozzi, the Democrat running for re-election, or not re-election, election now in this district, left office in 2022 to run for governor of the state of New York. And when he lost, it gave a prime opportunity to Republicans to win control of that seat, and they ultimately ended up doing so. But there's a stark difference in terms of margin and expectation for both parties in this election versus the past one. In 2022, arguably, Democrats should have been able to maintain control of this election, considering that Biden won the district by nearly 10 points. George Santos swinging the district by around 16 is pretty uniform with the overall performance of Democrats across the state in the state of New York. You found that Democrats won the popular vote in the House elections by around just 13 points, when in years prior they had won by even larger margins, 25 in 2020 and around 26 in 2018. And so to see that reduced in 2022, something must have gone fundamentally wrong, and that was who was at the top of the ticket. At the time, it was Governor Kathy Hochul, who ended up only winning her re-election bid by around 6 points in a state President Biden had won by 25. Clearly, there was a lot of crossover support that translated to down-ballot support for Republicans up across the state of New York. But this time around, the voters have returned to their priors. Rather than allow their 2022 vote to lead the way in how they vote in this election, the voters in New York seem to be very, very clear here that they want Tom Suozzi, the Democrat, to maintain the district in Democratic control as it was prior to George Santos. Tom Suozzi was a very well-known candidate and honestly one of the best candidates, if not the best, Democrat that Democrats could have fielded for this race. I know they were very worried because there was no primary season, so it ultimately came down to somebody who's willing to get into this race, hit the ground running, and move immediately into the general election without any level of preparation or overall just general preparedness for this race in any regard, and Tom Suozzi was up to the challenge. Now, the reason why I also think that this is such a substantial victory here for Democrats is because of these county margins. Now, we have Nassau County that has only reported around 45% of the votes, but the county, Queens County here, or District 3 and District 3 for Nassau County, it's a little bit weird to explain. You have a borough, you have a county, you have an overall congressional district. We will refer to them by the names Queens and Nassau. It should be pretty easy to explain, but it's not standard as it might be seen in other parts of the country. The point is that Queens here in 2022 went to the Democrats by a very, very narrow margin. When it came down to the overall results on the countywide level, you found that in this district, in Queens, Patrick Zimmerman, Robert Zimmerman, won the Democratic nomination here. He ended up getting around 50 to 60% of the vote in Queens. And then in Nassau, George Santos got around 50 to 60% of the vote. Now, what I will say is that it is very interesting because these two counties, while seemingly one might rival the other in population, you do see overwhelmingly disproportionate amounts of population in Nassau versus Queens. For example, in 2022, around 80% of the vote in this district came entirely from Nassau County, so you're finding that that really does drive the district. But when we're taking a look at these results in Queens County, keep in mind that you saw that Zimmerman won by 50 to 61 with around 50 to 60% of the vote. The margin there ended up being around 52 62 to 48. And so when you see Queens here with Tom Suozzi winning with 91% of votes reported, 62 to 38, you are already seeing a Democrat +4 district turning into a Democrat +24 part of the district. And so on that alone, we knew that Tom Suozzi was building up a firewall here. It would take a lot, and a portion of the county and a portion of the state, the district. I'm confusing my terminology here. I apologize for that. I'm trying to, really hammer in this point here. So back to the point of Queens, 24-point advantage here for the Democrats. And while it is a fifth of the district's population in terms of voting population, voting participation, it still helps break down that 8-point advantage that George Santos had. Now moving over to Nassau, George Santos did phenomenally well here back in 2022. When you take a look at the district here, this is what gave George Santos that overwhelming victory. But now, not only is it not a district that Mazie Pilip is leading in by a substantial amount the way that George Santos did, it's a district, a part of the district, that Tom Suozzi is presently winning. Now, with 55% of votes outstanding, I do expect this race to narrow. Tom Suozzi is likely not going to win by 16, 17, 18 points, as is presently projected. But a victory in the double-digit range is not off the table. The results here are clear. Tom Suozzi and the Democratic Party is riding an all-time high in New York's 3rd District, to a point where they may even match their results in 2020 when they won with Tom Suozzi in the state of New York by a margin of 12.5% in a district that was around 5 points more pro-Biden, 5 points more pro-Democrat than it is now. And so what I think this tells us is that despite what I think we will see from some of the mainstream pundits and the media, that these special elections mean nothing for the general election, I reject that notion. Because I distinctly remember how important special elections were back in 2018, when Democrats were getting moral victories, when Kansas in the 4th District ended up going to Ron Estes against James Thompson by a margin of 2, 3, 4 points, and it predicted that a blue wave was on the way. None other than Jon Ossoff in the state of Georgia in the 6th District here lost to Karen Handel by a margin of around 2 to 3 points. A district that had voted for Tom Price by 30 points in 2016 reduced down to just low single digits in 2017. A warning sign, a moral victory. Connor Lamb in the state of Pennsylvania, who won across the state in the 17th district. He flipped a Trump plus 20 district, redistricted, and then he won re-election in a competitive toss-up seat. These special elections are more often than not early indicators of performances for either side of the aisle. And what we have seen in 2018, and what we saw in 2019, and what we saw in 2022, in these elections, we found that Democrats do well in special elections that more often than not translate to strong performances in the general election. Remember when the Dobbs decision leaked and we talked about Nebraska's 1st District, which went to the Republican here by around 5 points? Now, it ended up 16 on Election Day, but it was an indicator that Democrats were enthusiastic and turning out in a race where you otherwise might not have expected them to. Now, this district in specific, the Democrats have built up such a large level of a firewall here because of the early and mail-in votes. To put things into perspective, in 2022, you found that there were nearly 300,000 voters across New York's 3rd District. 80,000 of them were mail-in or early voters. This time around, you are finding that you're roughly around 100,000 votes in, with 50% of the vote in, which means we will likely be at a range of 160, 170, 180,000 total votes. Do you know how many were early and mail-in? 78,000. Now, 78,000 and 80,000 might not seem too different. But in terms of the overall proportion, when it comes down to this special election, it's looking more like 1 in 2 votes were early and mail-in. In the election in 2022, a lot more like 1 in 3. And so the reason why that matters is because Democrats in the early and mail-in vote built up a 14-point party registration advantage over the GOP. The Republicans simply could not turn out on Election Day. Whether it was the snowstorm, whether it was lack of enthusiasm, whether it was lack of knowledge around the special election, one thing is clear. The voters who are paying attention, the voters who are angry, and the voters who are the most enthusiastic to turn out against all odds, more often than not now, seem to lean more Democratic. And this seems to be a consistent trend following the Dobbs v. Jackson decision. Everything comes down to a common denominator here. Now, we can't ignore the external factors here. Republicans were in terrible shape in this 3rd district under George Santos. Mazie Pilip was supposed to put them back on track. The Nassau GOP ran the Mazie Pilip campaign and arguably not really paying off when it comes down to these eventual results. But what I think we can take away from this is that although there were external factors here, the Democrats are alive and well and doing very, very well when it comes down to these special elections. I mean, there was all this narrative being built up over the past couple of months because we have been so far away from our Kentucky and Ohio election that reminded us that Democrats were still in it to win it. That reminded us that there is absolutely still a pathway forward for President Biden and Democrats in the House and Democrats in the Senate. I think we are getting to a point where the media has built up this narrative that it is going to be a Republican victory in 2024. And I believe today, if the election was held now, I mean, maybe I don't know, honestly, because I think that this is completely reshaping the way of taking a look at some of these more focused and specialized and more, viewed districts that have a huge independent population, that have swayed back and forth, and that are now questioning whether or not I do think this 3rd district would all of a sudden swing heavily in favor of Trump. I'm interested to see what these final results end up showing, because I certainly think they will tell us a much bigger picture here. I do not like to lean into this idea that special elections mean nothing, because they often mean everything. They are warning signs for each side of the aisle here. And I think Republicans should see this and realize that grip they had in 2022 under New York, more likely than not, was an anomaly under poor leadership and poor Democratic strategization by the New York Democratic Party, and more specifically, Governor Kathy Hochul. That was a failure on the side of that part of 2022. What you saw was that Democrats everywhere else were doing quite well, but in New York, they started to collapse. That's why Republicans now have just 10 reps in the House from New York. Because if it was a consistent thing, and it was determined to be fact and true, and the reality of the New York GOP for election after election, they would not have lost this one by double digits. And I think we also underestimated the amount of support that Tom Suozzi was going to win, because get this, the polls told us to. Remember all those polls back in 2022 that said that all of a sudden the Republicans were going to dominate in the House? The same polls that said Blake Masters was going to win in the Arizona Senate race, that Adam Laxalt was going to win the Nevada Senate race, that Dr. Oz was going to be the next senator from Pennsylvania, that Herschel Walker was going to defeat Raphael Warnock, if not in the first round, but in the runoff. Polls after polls after polls, exhausting ones that we spent countless hours analyzing, staring at, discussing, for them all, nearly, in uniform, to be off in favor, get this, not of Democrats, but overestimating Republicans. Wasn't just the House, it wasn't just the Senate, it was the governorship too, and now it seems to be special elections as well. Now, depending on this final margin here, it could reduce down to around 4 points. But Tom Suozzi winning this vote with over 50% of the votes in, but just shy under 60, tells us that this race was not as close as anyone expected it to be. I think Democrats and Republicans were looking at this and saying, this will be the real battle for this election. And they found that it was practically a cakewalk for Democrats. Even I expected the margin to be narrow. I did think that Tom Suozzi was destined for victory. Said that in my video today, and it made sense. And I think it does make sense, and clearly that was the right way to look at things. I wasn't the only one, obviously. Almost everyone said that Democrats were going to win this district because everything made sense. It was an election that when you looked at it from the lens of just the polls, Tom Suozzi was going to win by just 4, and it was going to be a nail-biter. All these pundits were saying we are within polling margin of error for this district to go red. And they're right, but the polls were wrong. And so the data we were working off of indicated that the race was going to be a lot closer. And I'm starting to see this build out a very interesting but much, much bigger picture. That the polls pretty consistently, since the Dobbs decision, have underestimated Democrats in nearly every single regard. Whether it's this district, whether it's the Ohio abortion referendum, whether it's the Kentucky governor's race, whether it's all those governor races from 22, whether the special elections from 22, the Senate races from 22, the House elections from 22. What we are finding is that while there is disenchantment from many of the core voters for Democrats in these states, in these swing districts, on the presidential, when push comes to shove, they turn out to vote for their Democratic nominees, even in districts like this. And while I don't claim at all to believe that New York's 3rd District represents the country at all, a Long Island district will not be representative of the rest of the nation to any real point, right? Every district is unique. Every district seems to come into a point where there are different factors at play. George Santos probably being one of the biggest that none of the other 434 districts have to deal with time and time again, right? Didn't have to deal with that in ads this special election season. But I think the takeaway from here can absolutely be that this is good news for Democrats. It doesn't mean the 24 election is somehow now solid for the Democrats whatsoever. But what it does indicate is that they have pathways to win, they can turn out their base, and they absolutely have shown in recent elections and special elections that 2024 is not moving as poorly away from them as the media and whoever else on the Republican side of things is suggesting. That is all noise. And while President Biden may not be as well positioned today as he will be in November, it is a race that is absolutely still competitive, and by no means is this election going to be easy for the GOP, especially now that they are down an additional House seat that they will have to fight back for in 2024. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.